the very in vogue thing I think I've seen on TikTok, the deconstructing your faith movement, whatever that means specifically. Yeah. But how would you respond to folks who say that they feel better after doing that?
Right on, brother, I hear you. Man, I hear you. Good for you, man. Good for you, good for you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Professor Plank. I respond to various theological and ideological questions and claims from a rationalistic and naturalistic approach in an effort to give and explain the opposite viewpoint and help to balance the conversation. Today we're going to be hearing from our old pal William Lane Craig, or as he's less affectionately known as, Low Bar Bill.
I thought to myself, and I'm not kidding, I thought, if there is just one chance in a million that this is true, it's worth believing. And so my attitude toward this is just the opposite of Kyle's. Far from raising the bar or the epistemic standard that Christianity must meet to be believed, I lower it.
Now, myself and other counter-apologists are quick to use that little clip against Bill, and to put it in context as to why, it's because Bill is making an illogical and fallacious appeal to consequence as a reason to lower the bar, as he puts it, for what evidence he would require in order to believe in the existence of God. Appeal to consequence being when one concludes that an idea or proposition is true or false because the consequences of it being true or false are desirable or undesirable. The fallacy lies in the fact that the desirability is not related to the truth value of an idea or proposition. This comes in two forms, the positive and the negative. And Bill is guilty of both the positive and the negative form. The positive in the supposed benefits he expects to receive both in this life and a presumed afterlife if God exists and he makes that God happy. And then in the negative in avoiding the presumed negative consequence of going to hell if one does not keep the Christian faith. In that regard, Bill is a walking example of falling into the foolishness of Pascal's wager. Better to be a Christian and be wrong and have no negative consequence as a result than be an atheist and be wrong and go to hell as a result. Which of course ignores the possibility of any other religion besides Christianity being correct, in which case the Christian is, well, potentially worse off than the atheist in the event that some God does exist, and that God likes non-believers a heck of a lot more than false faith believers like Christianity. So anyway, Bill showcases his lack of intellectual rigor and confirmation bias, not even by a slip of the tongue, but by proudly proclaiming it with his full chest. He lowers his epistemic bar just because he wants it to be true. Well, today, we're going to be hearing about what he thinks of people who don't follow his example. When people deconstruct the faiths that they were indoctrinated into as children, and then get older and decide to actually put their religion through a bit of logic and reason scrutiny to see whether or not it holds water. Something that is completely anathema to old Billy. So let's hear what he has to say on the idea of people actually recognizing that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and then expecting a belief in an all-powerful, omniscient, omnibenevolent supernatural being to be able to comply with such a requirement. But before we get to that, if you end up liking what you see in this video and would like to help out the channel, make sure to subscribe and click the bell so you'll always be notified when new content comes out. Check out my social media, including my Patreon, Twitter, and Blue Sky, all linked in the description. And of course, like this video, pop in a comment. All that goes a long way towards pleasing the YouTube algorithm, that proud proponent of pragmatism and pillar of practicality, pissing off pious proselytizers, pietistic pontificators, may keep my channel motoring along. Now on to today's video.
The very in vogue thing I think I've seen on TikTok, the deconstructing your faith movement, whatever that means specifically. Yeah. But how would you respond to folks who say that they feel better after doing that?
I think how you feel is irrelevant.
I'm sorry, Bill. What the hell did you just say?
I think how you feel is irrelevant.
Bill, you are the king of going with your feelings. The entire reason you lower your epistemic bar is not because of any intellectual assertion that Christianity is likely or probable. It isn't based on hard examination of the evidence. You didn't take your feelings out of the equation and dispassionately calculate the odds and likelihood of the inerrancy of the Christian faith. You by your own admission, lowered any epistemic standard in favor of leaning into what you want to be true and what you hope in your feelings is the case. You only remove the need for an epistemic standard because you feel that Christianity is the right way to go. Well, Bill, I think how you feel is irrelevant. Christianity has clearly not met any logical burden of proof and thus should be rejected, or at least tabled, until it manages to do so. And your feelings on the matter are irrelevant. Bill talks out of both sides of his mouth when it suits him to do so. He's all about feelings and emotional drive when his faith can't be proven or even shown to be likely from a rational or evidentiary perspective. But then when any non-believer starts delving into the emotional toll religion can take, not even as a reason in and of itself to not believe, but merely as an exploration of the mental harm that religion can cause and how to deal with it, then Billy wants to go all Ben Shapiro on everybody.
These are facts, and facts don't care about your feelings.
Which is also a tactic Bill will often take whenever he's presented with the problem of evil, or the idea of the God of the Bible commanding immoral acts. He'll insist that how you or I feel about what God does or doesn't allow is irrelevant, because if God is doing it, then it must be right and good for him to do so. It's feelings when it suits him, cold, hard, unempathetic, Bible-imposed notions of reality when it doesn't.
I could well imagine that some people who have been really struggling with Christian faith would feel real relieved about letting it go. But that doesn't determine truth.
Yes, I know all about feelings. Everything's just going fine, and somebody has a feeling. And kaboom! Suddenly they don't like you. I think we can all do without feelings. Who's with me? Your grade depends on it.
I find it to be just the opposite. Deconstruction of one's faith, in my experience, is rarely a process that causes one to feel relief. At least not while it's ongoing. And it is generally a long process. Religious beliefs are often deeply intertwined with our personal identities and values. Deconstructing these beliefs can feel like losing a part of ourselves and can lead to feelings of loss, grief, and confusion. Most people are confronted with an utter loss of self when they deconstruct. They say things like, if I'm not a Christian, then who am I? What am I? What do I believe if I don't believe the faith that I've always believed in? It's not a pleasant feeling. Not to mention the fact that religion is awfully deeply intertwined with a person's family, community, and social circle. Deconstructing can lead to feelings of isolation and alienation, as one distances themselves from practically everyone around them due to their changing beliefs. Some people even get disowned and ostracized from their family, cast out to fend for themselves just because they struggled with the beliefs that they were forced into and later found their way out of. Now, most people who end up becoming non-believers after a deconstruction of their religion do find peace and relief once they've fully mentally processed, no longer adhering to that belief system, and have navigated those difficult personal relationships and cultural differences. But again, this is a process that often takes years. Personally, it took me a solid 5 years to deconstruct my Catholic faith, and I tend to think I had a much easier go of it than a lot of people in more fundamental and radical religious organizations and families. I mean, I haven't had a single person that I know or care about chastise me or berate me or try to coerce me back into the faith. But as comparatively easy as I had it, it was still a long, arduous, and mentally taxing process. And it wasn't one I undertook in order to feel any kind of relief. I took it because I couldn't honestly believe in the Christian faith anymore. And because I care more about what's true than what would make me feel good. Because certainly it would have been easier and would have felt better, at least in the short term, to just turn a blind eye to my misgivings and questions about the religion and just accept it, despite it failing to live up to even the lowest of epistemological standards.
Feelings are very deceptive and misleading. The question is, what is the truth? And I am not in the least interested in deconstructing someone's faith. I'm interested in constructing a Christian world and life view that is biblically coherent and in accord with the best philosophical, scientific, historical, psychological facts that we know.
So either Bill doesn't know what deconstruction is, or he's just a dishonest hack. I'll let you decide which. But deconstruction happens more often than not when one cannot reconcile what the faith purports as true with what the best philosophical, scientific, historical, and psychological facts say to be true. I mean, when you realize that the creation myth about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden are not commiserate with the scientific and historical facts, and that humans arrived via evolution, not a magic spell being cast on a pile of dirt, you have to deconstruct that part of the faith or languish in defiant ignorance. When you realize that the idea of a soul, an ethereal spirit driving our bodies, is not commiserate with the scientific, psychological facts, and that the neurological model of human psychology, that all of our thoughts, feelings, memories, and experiences are carried out and produced by our brains, then you have to deconstruct that part of the faith or languish in defiant ignorance. And 1,000 other aspects of the Christian religion and pretty much any other religion that are not in keeping with the facts. So, Bill, when you say that you aren't interested in deconstructing faith, but instead you're interested in the facts of reality, well, which is it? Because those two things are, more often than not, at complete odds with each other.
And so I think the whole project of building a Christian world and life view is one of construction, not deconstruction.
Maybe Bill actually doesn't understand what deconstruction means. Of course, building a Christian worldview is a process of construction, but that should not be the goal. The goal isn't, or at least shouldn't be, specifically to build any kind of religious worldview. The goal should be to build a worldview that is, as accurately as possible, comporting with reality. That should at least be a goal of every person. Everyone should want to accept and live their life in accordance with what is true, and reject that which is not true. And so, hitching your wagon to one ideology alone and stubbornly insisting upon its validity, in defiance of the facts of reality, is a bad way of going through this thing called life. And when one is brought up with a flawed and inaccurate ideology, of course one needs to first deconstruct that ideology before they can more properly install a more correct one in its place. I mean, to break it down a bit easier, what would Bill say to a person who was raised Hindu and was thinking about deconstructing their Hindu beliefs? Would he say that they shouldn't deconstruct that because that's not a good way to get to truth? Would Bill say that a Buddhist shouldn't deconstruct their Buddhism? Of course not. He'd be all for that deconstruction, just not the deconstruction of the Christian faith. But the way he's framing his comments, he seems to be at odds with the entire idea of deconstruction in the first place. We shouldn't forget that not everyone who puts their faith through a process of deconstruction ends up deconverting out of it or becoming an atheist either. Some people actually stick with their faith and become more resolute in their beliefs as a result of their deconstruction. So basically, it seems that Bill is advocating for never questioning or challenging specifically the Christian faith, because he's afraid that it will, more often than not, lead people out of believing in Christianity. You know, one would think that if your faith represents the actual truth of reality, it would be able to hold up to the scrutiny of religious deconstruction. Maybe the fact that Christianity often can't is at least a minor indication of its flaws.
And these people who are deconstructing, I suspect, are just reacting emotionally to bad experiences they've had in the institutional church.
You have been hurt. You have been hurt by somebody. That much is clear. Who hurt you? Who hurt you? Who hurt you? Who hurt you? Who hurt you?
And now we come to the tactic that allows Bill to hand-wave away the very idea that there's any substance to religious deconstruction. Oh, you're just deconstructing because someone hurt you in the church. You must have had bad experiences with your priest or pastor. You must have been abused or emotionally traumatized, and you're just projecting that hurt onto the faith itself. Well, not to take away from the validity of those who have suffered abuse or torment within religious organizations, but people more often than not deconstruct because of dissatisfaction with the faith rather than trauma suffered from it. A recent study of people who have left their religion and became non-believers found that about half of the sample, 51.8%, reported leaving for intellectual reasons or because they outgrew their faith. When it came to those leaving for traumatic reasons, roughly a fifth of the sample, 21.9%, reported religious trauma, such as hypocrisy of the sexual abuse scandals in the Catholic Church. And it should also be noted that such religious trauma wasn't necessarily perpetrated upon the person leaving the faith, but could also include their distaste for the way the religion handled such incidents that were perpetrated upon others. But then when it comes to those who have suffered trauma in their religion, there wasn't a direct correlation between that trauma and deconstruction or a lessening of their faith. Most people do not change their religious beliefs after a trauma, but significant changes occur for a smaller portion of people, either increasing or decreasing their religious beliefs. So there's just as much likelihood of a person who has suffered trauma within their religion to increase their faith as there is for it to decrease. So to hand wave away everyone who's deconstructed as silly people who have been hurt and are just reacting out of anger at that hurt, and totally discount the clear majority of the deconverted who did so based on intellectual reasoning, is just Bill hiding from criticism that he can't sufficiently stand up against.
Yeah, I mean, given the pervasiveness of this on social media and other things, I mean, do you have any kind of ideas or thoughts on root causes or how this has gained traction?
From what I've been told from people who do have more experience with this, is that these folks tend to come out of very conservative Christian churches that have been authoritarian, and they have often had negative emotional experiences in the church that have left them hurt and damaged, and they're reacting against that.
Oh, well, if it was according to these anonymous people who you claim to have a lot of experience in dealing with religious deconstructionists, I mean, I guess I'll just totally take you at your word that only people who have suffered under the yoke of authoritarian, hyper-conservative faiths deconstruct. I mean, how could I possibly argue if you have secondhand accounts of some people who claim to know this stuff? It's not like there's data that we can look at to check to see which religions are dropping off the most. Oh, wait, we do. Christianity across the board has been on an increasing decline for multiple decades, with both Protestantism and Catholicism losing members. Meanwhile, other religions, some of which are arguably far more authoritarian and conservative, like Islam, have held steady in their percentage of the American population. Frankly, the only religion that has seen any kind of decline has been Christianity. And nothing I could find indicated any particular denomination of Christianity showing any trends other than dropping. Oh, I'm sorry, except for one, Mormons. The Mormons seem to be holding pretty steady over the last 20 years according to their church attendance rates. It's not just the conservative or authoritarian faiths and denominations that are losing members. And another little wrinkle in that notion is that if that were true, if the most conservative and authoritarian of churches were the ones losing members to deconstruction and eventual deconversion, we would expect the states that are home to the most conservative and authoritarian churches to have the lowest rates of God belief. But instead, we see the exact opposite, where the most conservative states like Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Kentucky have the highest rates of God belief. And the states home to the most liberal and progressive denominations, like California, Oregon, or New York, have among the lowest rates of God belief. And of course, this entire line of thinking about conservative versus liberal churches and bad experiences driving people out of the faith runs entirely counter to what we've already established, that most deconstruct for intellectual reasons. People tend to deconstruct for things like a search for truth and the inability to find any semblance of truth in a religion that stubbornly clings to notions of a global flood that provably never happened, a 7-day creation myth that provably never happened, a flat earth, according to some interpretations, that provably isn't the case for our planet, and a religion that insists on giants and leviathans and people living hundreds and hundreds of years at a time when a toothache infection could be fatal. When former Christians realize how factually incorrect so much of the Bible and the wider faith is, and then extend that possibility of error to everything in the Bible that wasn't independently verified from non-biblical sources, we realize that none of it could be taken at face value, and that it was all in contrast with
the best philosophical, scientific, historical, psychological facts that we know. And as I say, following emotions is not the way to get at truth.
That's rich coming from you.
That is deceptive and misleading. And so I guess what I would want to do is not so much criticize them. I mean, we can have compassion on them for what they're doing. But I want to present an alternative, more glorious vision.
a more glorious vision? You want to specifically lean into the idea of presenting a vision that people might find glorious? Glorious, meaning having, worthy of, or bringing fame and admiration, having striking beauty or splendor that evokes feelings of delighted admiration. Wait, Bill, I thought feelings wasn't a way to get to truth. I thought feelings can be deceptive and misleading. But now that you think you can use feelings to snatch up some converts, now you're all about establishing a glorious vision intended to evoke feelings of admiration. What, because now you think you can use feelings to get what you want? To hell with any notion of whether or not those feelings accurately comport with reality. I mean, a glorious vision relies heavily on emotional appeals and can be manipulative, as it can bypass critical thinking and reasoning. It can exploit vulnerabilities. This kind of emotional appeal often lacks substance and fails to address the core issues or provide evidence to support the claims. This can lead to superficial conversions that are not based on sound reasoning or genuine conviction. Emotional manipulation can be harmful, especially when it involves sensitive topics like religion or spirituality. It can create division, conflict, and even trauma for individuals who feel pressured or coerced into believing something that they may not truly believe. The same kind of emotional trauma that you're erroneously concluding is the reason for people's deconstruction in the first place, Bill.
Namely, a vision of constructing a Christian world and life view that makes sense of reality and is biblically consistent. I think that positive, glorious project is one that can capture a person's imagination and help to free him from these emotional things that would drag him back down.
What the hell are you talking about? Who are you talking to?
And there you have it. Bill wants to use emotionally manipulative tactics of expressing a glorious vision of Christianity in order to overcome the intellectual problems and cognitive dissonance that a person deconstructing their faith is dealing with, and sway them back to a faith that they struggled so much in freeing themselves from in the first place, so that they could engage in their exploration of what they actually believed and why. Bill wants to throw back on the chains of oppressive religious indoctrination that they'd just cast off. And he calls this freeing them. He criticized emotional reasoning for being the only reason that people deconstruct in the first place when it clearly isn't, but then leans into using emotional manipulation to bring such people back into the fold. He dismisses feelings as misleading and not a way to reach truth, but then wants to use feelings to correctly lead people to what he views as the truth. I'd say he's a scummy religious con man, but at this point, I'm beginning to wonder if he's not actually slipping into senility to the point where he forgets what he said at the start of his sentences by the time he reaches the end of them. But, of course, Bill, more often than not, like most apologists, is just preaching to the choir and making the already faithful feel more resolute in their beliefs. Tell your Christian audience that only people who deconstruct their faith are poor, sad, unfortunate souls who have been traumatized by bad experiences in the church.
Poor souls with no one else to turn to.
That way, they can discount any former Christian non-believer out of hand. After all, it isn't anything resembling valid logical reasons to not believe in God or to turn away from the faith. It's just that they've been hurt. And as long as I don't have to go through that kind of hurt, then my faith will never falter. Because Bill Craig here just showed me how there isn't any decent reason to not believe in God. It's all just bad emotions, you see. Of course, this is not how things actually work. Feelings isn't the primary driver of people away from religion, and it certainly isn't the main impetus for the deconstruction of one's faith. Nor even for those who are driven by an emotional impetus to deconstruct, does that mean that the conclusions they come to, should that be a rejection of the faith itself, is not in accordance with reality. If a religion and a faith are false, then they're false. And it doesn't matter what motivated a deconvert to reach that conclusion. So, in summation, if Low Bar Bill decries emotion as a path to truth, then he's a hypocrite for basing his own lowering of the epistemic bar on emotion, and he's a further hypocrite for trying to use emotion to drive people back to the faith when they deconstruct and find their way out of it. He strawmans non-believers and our motivations for our non-belief about as easily as he breathes, and at the end of the day, he doesn't seem to even understand what the word deconstruction even means. Oh yeah, and in case you weren't aware, this is one of the supposed best apologists out there. Well, if this is the best they have to offer, I am thoroughly unimpressed. And so that is where we'll end things for today. So thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like this video, comment, and subscribe so you'll always be notified when a new video comes out. Check me out on Twitter and Patreon if you'd like to support my work directly, and more recently on Blue Sky. My Teespring if you want some Plinky merchandise, all that link below in the description. Special shout out to my most recent super thankers here on YouTube, Salvi Mike, Jaffa7243, Balin, and Extra Large Deal Dough. Until next time, I'm Professor Plink, reminding you to keep striving for greater understanding. It's the best way to get wherever you want to go.